June 18, 1983, 12:42 p.m. The park was already at capacity by midday. Folding tables were positioned beneath mature trees whose canopies had been providing shade to families for decades. Coolers were placed at measured distances from blankets. Children moved in predictable loops between the swings and the paved walking path. At 12:42 p.m., a man crossed the eastern footpath carrying nothing in his hands. He paused briefly near a trash receptacle that had not yet been used that day. His stop lasted less than 8 seconds. When he resumed walking, the position of a paper bag beneath the bench behind him had changed slightly. No one reacted. No one noticed. The afternoon continued uninterrupted. The park occupied a rectangular section of municipal land bordered on 3 sides by residential streets and on the 4th by a drainage canal lined with brush. Its layout had remained unchanged since the late 1950s. 2 parking lots fed into 4 main walking paths. Picnic areas were fixed, each with concrete tables bolted into the ground. There were no blind corners, no restricted zones, and no reason for security patrols beyond occasional city maintenance. On weekends, the environment produced a reliable density of movement, enough to obscure individual behavior without creating disorder. It was a place designed for visibility without scrutiny. The family picnic that day followed a pattern established years earlier. It occurred once every 6 to 8 weeks during warm months, usually on Saturdays. Attendance varied but rarely dropped below 20 people. Arrival times clustered between noon and 1 o'clock. Food preparation followed the same sequence. Vehicles were parked along the southern lot first, then overflowed north. Cleanup began promptly at 4:30 p.m. The event had no formal organizer, but responsibility rotated predictably among the same individuals. It was not spontaneous. It was routine. One attendee, whose role in the gathering was logistical rather than social, had attended nearly every picnic since the tradition began. Their responsibilities included transporting supplies, accounting for leftovers, and ensuring nothing was left behind. This role required attention to objects, placement, and sequence. It encouraged observation without intrusion. The observer knew where items were set down and when they were retrieved. They knew which tables were unused and which benches remained empty. Their familiarity with the environment came not from surveillance but from repetition. The observer arrived that day at 11:58 a.m. as they usually did. They parked in the southern lot, noted the availability of spaces, and unloaded containers near the third picnic table from the west. The weather was clear, temperature moderate, wind negligible. These details mattered only insofar as they affected behavior. Nothing about the day suggested deviation from past gatherings. Throughout the early afternoon, background figures moved through the park in consistent patterns. Joggers passed along the perimeter path at steady intervals. An older couple occupied the same bench they favored each weekend, staying for approximately 40 minutes before departing. A man with a camera photographed birds near the canal. None of these figures interacted with the picnic group. Their presence was familiar enough to blend into the setting, part of the expected rhythm of the space. By 12:30 p.m., all tables assigned to the picnic were occupied. Food was uncovered. Children were directed away from the grill area. The observer conducted a habitual visual sweep, noting that the eastern benches remained unclaimed. They always did. Those benches sat closer to the canal and lacked shade. They were less desirable for gatherings and typically used only as rest points by passers-by. Between 12:30 and 1:15 p.m., 3 individuals passed through the eastern path area without stopping for leisure. Each arrived alone. Each walked at a pace inconsistent with exercise but too deliberate to suggest wandering. None carried picnic items. None used the facilities. Their presence registered only as part of the environment, indistinguishable from dozens of others who passed through public spaces daily. The observer did not track these individuals consciously. They had no reason to. Their attention remained on supplies, waste management, and maintaining the routine flow of the gathering. If anything, the observer's awareness was directed inward, toward the logistics of the picnic itself. At approximately 2:10 p.m., a light wind shifted several loose items on the nearest table. Napkins were weighted down. Plates were repositioned. This prompted the observer to move briefly toward the eastern benches to retrieve a container that had been stored earlier in the day. It was during this movement that the observer noticed a paper bag beneath one of the benches. It was folded neatly, placed flush against the concrete support. The bag was unmarked and appeared unused. The observer assumed it belonged to someone passing through earlier and made no effort to retrieve it. The picnic continued without interruption. Food was consumed. Conversations formed and dissolved. Children rotated through games. The observer returned to their tasks. The bag beneath the bench remained where it was. No one approached it. No one searched for it. No one reacted to its presence. By mid-afternoon, attendance began to thin. Some families departed early as they often did. Cleanup started in stages. Trash bags were filled and tied. Tables were wiped down. The observer conducted a second sweep of the area, collecting items that had been overlooked. The paper bag beneath the eastern bench was still there. At 4:45 p.m., the picnic concluded. Vehicles exited the lots in the same order they had arrived. The observer completed their final check, ensuring no personal items remained behind. The bag beneath the bench was still present. The observer assumed it would be collected by maintenance or removed by another park visitor. It did not stand out enough to justify intervention. The following picnic occurred 5 weeks later under similar conditions. The same tables were used. The same arrival window held. Weather conditions differed slightly, but attendance remained within expected range. Again, the eastern benches remained largely unused. Again, individuals passed through the area without engaging in recreational activity. Again, a small object appeared beneath a bench after the picnic was underway. The observer noted this only after the event had concluded. The object differed in shape from the earlier bag but occupied nearly the same position relative to the bench support. It was not examined. It was not retrieved. It was simply noticed, registered, and dismissed as coincidence. Over the course of several months, the pattern repeated. The picnic itself never changed. No one outside the group joined. No one inside altered their behavior. Yet each time, something small and unattended appeared briefly in the eastern section of the park during the same window of time. The objects were always unclaimed. They were always gone by the following day. The observer did not yet suspect anything illegal or coordinated. At this stage, the pattern existed only as a background irregularity, too subtle to demand explanation, too consistent to be entirely random. The picnic remained what it had always been, a family routine conducted in a public space, observed only by those with reason to pay attention. The observer did not mark the pattern immediately. It emerged gradually, assembled from fragments of routine rather than from a single event. After the third picnic in which an unattended object appeared beneath the eastern benches, the observer began reviewing the previous gatherings in memory, not with suspicion but with an instinct for consistency. The dates aligned. The weather varied. Attendance fluctuated slightly. Yet the timing of the irregularity remained stable, always occurring after the picnic had fully settled and before cleanup began. On August 27, 1983, the observer arrived earlier than usual, entering the park at 11:32 a.m. The eastern path was empty at that time. No objects were present beneath the benches. The picnic group arrived in staggered intervals between 11:50 a.m. and 12:25 p.m. Food preparation began immediately. At 12:41 p.m., a man entered the park from the canalside access point, walked directly toward the eastern benches, paused briefly, and exited using the northern path. The pause lasted less than 10 seconds. He did not sit. He did not look toward the picnic area. The observer did not approach the benches. They noted only the time. At 1:03 p.m., while retrieving additional supplies from a vehicle, the observer passed the eastern benches and noticed a folded item beneath the second bench from the south. It was rectangular and flat, placed parallel to the concrete support. The observer continued walking without stopping. After the picnic concluded at 4:38 p.m., the observer conducted their routine sweep. The item beneath the bench was gone. The following picnic occurred on October 1, 1983. Weather conditions were cooler. Attendance was lower. The observer arrived at 11:47 a.m. The eastern benches were clear. At 12:36 p.m., a woman entered the park from the residential street bordering the east side. She walked past the benches without stopping, turned back after approximately 20 meters, and returned along the same path. When she passed the benches the second time, her pace slowed briefly. No object was visible immediately afterward. At 12:59 p.m., during a lull in activity, the observer walked toward the benches under the pretense of relocating a cooler. A small object was now present beneath the same bench position used previously. It was cylindrical and wrapped in plain material. The observer did not touch it. These sequences, when considered independently, appeared meaningless. The observer did not assign motive or intent. However, the repetition of timing, placement, and retrieval began to form a structure that felt deliberate. The observer began writing down dates and approximate times, not in a formal log, but as notes recorded after each picnic concluded. The notes were brief and factual. No interpretations were added. By November 12, 1983, the observer altered their routine slightly. They arrived 10 minutes earlier than usual and parked in the northern lot instead of the southern. This change allowed a clearer view of the eastern path without drawing attention. The picnic itself proceeded normally. At 12:44 p.m., two separate individuals entered the eastern area within a 5-minute window. They did not interact. Each paused briefly near the benches. No object appeared immediately. At 1:11 p.m., the observer noticed a thin envelope beneath the bench. It was unmarked and sealed. The observer continued past without stopping. At 3:58 p.m., shortly before cleanup began, a different individual approached the bench area, sat briefly, and left. When the observer checked the area during cleanup, the envelope was gone. The observer began to map routes. The individuals who paused near the benches did not arrive from the same direction consistently, but they departed along paths that avoided the picnic tables. None remained in the park longer than 15 minutes. None carried visible picnic supplies. None returned during the same event. What elevated the observer's concern was not the presence of strangers but the consistency of their behavior relative to the picnic's timeline. The objects never appeared before food was laid out. They never remained after cleanup concluded. The picnic, unintentionally, appeared to anchor the activity. On December 17, 1983, the observer conducted a controlled test. They delayed the placement of food on the tables by 20 minutes. The picnic group remained present, but the visible signals of a gathering were postponed. No individuals approached the eastern benches during that delay. Once food was uncovered at 12:55 p.m., activity near the benches resumed within 10 minutes. The observer recorded this deviation carefully. It suggested that the activity was keyed not to the date alone, but to visible confirmation of the picnic's progression. Over the next 3 gatherings, the observer refined their observations. They tracked arrival times within 5-minute increments. They noted footwear, clothing colors, and whether individuals carried bags. They paid attention to how objects were placed. Never thrown, never hidden aggressively, always positioned to be retrievable without searching. The observer did not yet consider espionage. However, the behavior no longer fit casual explanations. Lost items were not reclaimed in this manner. Trash was not removed so precisely. The individuals involved behaved as if responding to a schedule rather than to opportunity. By early February 1984, the observer decided to intervene minimally. During one picnic, after noting the placement of a small package beneath the bench, the observer positioned a folding chair nearby under the pretense of additional seating. This obstructed direct access to the bench without blocking it entirely. The package remained untouched for over an hour. At 3:22 p.m., an individual approached, hesitated upon seeing the chair, sat briefly at the far end of the bench, and left without retrieving the item. During cleanup, the observer returned the chair to storage. By the next morning, the package was gone. This was the first time an object remained overnight. The observer concluded that the activity was coordinated, cautious, and adaptive. Someone was monitoring conditions and adjusting behavior accordingly. The picnic was not incidental. It was functional. The observer did not act immediately. They continued attending picnics. They continued documenting. They avoided discussion with other attendees. Whatever was unfolding depended on normalcy. Preserving that normalcy became essential. By the end of winter, the observer understood that continued passive observation carried its own risk. The pattern had stabilized. The behavior had adapted to interference. The activity was ongoing. The observer resolved that the next unattended object would not simply be noted. It would be examined. The next picnic occurred on March 24, 1984, under conditions nearly identical to those recorded in late autumn. Attendance returned to its usual range. Arrival times clustered tightly around noon. Food placement began at 12:18 p.m. The observer arrived early, positioned supplies, and resumed their established routine without deviation. Nothing about the gathering suggested interruption. At 12:47 p.m., a man entered the park from the eastern residential street. He wore neutral clothing appropriate for the season and carried no visible items. His pace was steady. He did not acknowledge the picnic group. He approached the eastern benches, paused briefly, then exited along the northern path. His stop lasted approximately 9 seconds. At 1:02 p.m., the observer approached the eastern benches under the pretense of retrieving a folding tray. Beneath the second bench from the south, positioned flush against the concrete support, was a compact rectangular object wrapped in plain brown paper. It had not been there earlier. For the first time since the pattern emerged, the observer did not walk past. The observer crouched briefly, shielding the movement with their body, and lifted the object. It was lighter than expected and firm to the touch. No markings were visible on the exterior. The observer placed it inside a plastic container already being carried, then returned to the picnic area without altering pace. The entire action lasted less than 15 seconds. The observer did not open the package. They did not examine it further on site. They continued participating in cleanup, food distribution, and routine tasks. The picnic concluded at 4:41 p.m. No one approached the eastern benches after the package was removed. Once home, the observer placed the package on a cleared surface and documented the time and conditions of retrieval. They photographed the exterior without disturbing the wrapping. The package measured approximately 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters and was sealed with adhesive tape applied cleanly and without excess. The observer noted that the tape bore no commercial branding. The observer did not attempt to access the contents. Instead, they reviewed their notes from previous months. The timeline was consistent. The package placement corresponded to the same window observed earlier. Its removal before cleanup confirmed that retrieval was expected. At 8:14 p.m., the observer contacted a federal tip line associated with counterintelligence reporting. The report was factual and restrained. The observer described repeated unattended objects, timing relative to a recurring public gathering, and the retrieval behavior. They disclosed possession of the most recent item. The response was measured. The observer was instructed to secure the item and await further contact. At 9:36 a.m. the following morning, 2 federal agents arrived at the observer's residence. Their identification was verified. The transfer of the package occurred in a neutral setting. The agents photographed the item, documented chain of custody, and placed it into a sealed evidence container. The observer provided copies of their notes, including dates, times, and behavioral descriptions. The agents did not speculate. They did not confirm suspicions. They asked procedural questions focused on consistency, environment, and personal involvement. The observer was advised to continue attending the picnics as usual and to report any deviations immediately. The package was transported to a federal facility for examination. Analysis began with non-invasive imaging, followed by material inspection. Inside the wrapping was a sealed inner envelope containing microfilm fragments and handwritten numerical strings. The handwriting was deliberate, uniform, and inconsistent with casual note-taking. The numerical sequences did not correspond to known commercial codes. Laboratory analysis determined that the paper stock was not commonly available in domestic retail channels. The adhesive composition of the tape matched materials used in controlled industrial contexts. The microfilm format aligned with intelligence transmission methods designed for concealment and rapid exchange. Based on these findings, the case was reclassified from anomalous activity to suspected foreign intelligence operation. The park was designated as an active site. Surveillance planning began immediately. The objective was not disruption, but observation. The picnic's role as environmental cover was now understood. Any overt change risked alerting unknown participants. The observer was briefed under controlled conditions. They were instructed not to alter behavior, not to discuss the matter, and not to intervene further. Their role shifted from passive observer to unwitting timing anchor for a federal operation. Over the next 2 picnics, no objects appeared beneath the benches. The absence was noted but not interpreted as termination. Intelligence operations often paused following disruption. On May 5, 1984, activity resumed. At 12:39 p.m., a folded object appeared beneath the same bench. Federal surveillance teams documented the placement remotely. No immediate retrieval occurred. At 2:58 p.m., a woman approached the bench area, sat briefly, and removed the object. She departed the park within 4 minutes. Her movements were tracked beyond the park boundary. She entered a residential building 2 blocks away and did not re-emerge. Federal agents did not intervene at that time. The objective remained identification of the broader network. Over subsequent weeks, analysis of the retrieved package continued. The numerical strings were determined to be encrypted message fragments. While full decryption was not achieved, partial reconstruction suggested tasking instructions rather than intelligence reporting. The picnic, previously incidental, was now understood as a signal environment. Its predictability provided cover, timing, and deniability. The observer's routine, unchanged for years, had been repurposed without their knowledge. Federal involvement expanded quietly. Additional resources were assigned. The observer was not informed of operational specifics. Their value lay in remaining ordinary. By early summer, the investigation had escalated beyond anomaly. It had entered the domain of counterintelligence, where conclusions were provisional and certainty remained elusive. By June 1984, the investigation had transitioned fully from reactive assessment to controlled surveillance. Federal counterintelligence units reclassified the park and its surrounding streets as a monitored operational environment. The objective was no longer to confirm suspicious behavior but to reconstruct an intelligence mechanism without disrupting it. The picnic, unchanged in form, remained the fixed variable around which all monitoring was structured. Surveillance assets were deployed in layers. Plainclothes officers entered the park as families, joggers, and municipal workers. Observation posts were established in nearby residences with unobstructed views of the eastern path and bench area. Vehicle movements were tracked discreetly through staggered positioning to avoid pattern detection. No electronic surveillance devices were placed inside the park itself to minimize exposure risk. On June 16, 1984, the picnic proceeded as scheduled. Food placement occurred at 12:21 p.m. At 12:46 p.m., a man entered from the canal-side access point and paused near the eastern benches. He placed a small object beneath the bench using a motion consistent with tying a shoelace. He departed within 3 minutes. Surveillance confirmed that the object remained undisturbed for nearly 2 hours. At 2:51 p.m., a second individual arrived, approached the bench, and retrieved the object without hesitation. The retrieval was smooth, practiced, and unaccompanied by searching behavior. The individual exited the park and entered a compact sedan parked 2 blocks north. The vehicle departed immediately. Federal teams followed the vehicle using leapfrog techniques, maintaining distance and rotating units. The vehicle traveled through residential streets, entered a commercial district, and stopped briefly near a public transit station. The individual exited, discarded packaging in a public receptacle, and boarded a bus. Surveillance continued until the subject entered a government office building where tracking was legally constrained. Cross-referencing vehicle registration, employment records, and travel history identified the individual as a mid-level administrative employee with periodic access to non-classified government facilities. No prior criminal activity was noted. The profile suggested asset status rather than operational control. Over the next 3 picnics, the same individual retrieved similar items on 2 occasions. Placement was conducted by different individuals each time. None interacted with the asset directly. This separation reinforced the assessment that the park functioned as a dead-drop site rather than a meeting point. On July 28, 1984, federal authorities executed a quiet detention of the asset during a routine commute. The arrest occurred away from the park to avoid alerting external observers. Evidence recovered included coded notes, concealment materials, and contact schedules encoded within ordinary documents. The interrogation was conducted over multiple sessions. No threats or inducements were employed beyond standard legal procedure. The asset acknowledged recruitment during a professional conference years earlier. Initial contact had been framed as academic exchange, followed by gradual tasking. Payments were modest and delivered indirectly. Motivation appeared to be ideological alignment reinforced by financial incentive. Operational methods were described in general terms. The asset never met their handler directly. Instructions were received through encoded materials placed at predetermined locations. The picnic served as temporal camouflage, ensuring predictable civilian density without attracting scrutiny. The asset was instructed never to deviate from established patterns. The handler's identity remained unknown. Communications were routed through layered cutouts. No direct identifiers were provided. The handler operated outside domestic jurisdiction, communicating through intermediaries who were never aware of the operation's full scope. Following the arrest, federal authorities continued surveillance at the park using controlled substitution. Dummy materials were placed to simulate continued activity. No retrieval occurred. The placement of objects ceased entirely within weeks. Analysis concluded that the network was limited in scale but professionally structured. The absence of recovery attempts after the arrest suggested either rapid detection of compromise or a pre-existing contingency plan. By September 1984, surveillance assets were gradually withdrawn. The park was returned to normal municipal status. The picnic resumed without alteration. Families continued to gather. Benches remained empty or occupied according to preference, not purpose. The investigation file expanded while actionable intelligence narrowed. What had been uncovered was precise but incomplete. The handler remained beyond reach. The full extent of information transferred was unknown. The operation had been neutralized without being fully understood. The case demonstrated how routine civilian activity could be repurposed invisibly, relying not on secrecy but on predictability. The picnic had not concealed espionage through drama or deception. It had concealed it through normalcy. When federal reporting concluded, the final assessment noted that no single moment had revealed the operation. It had been identified only through patience, repetition, and the decision to notice what most people ignored. By October 1984, federal counterintelligence officials concluded that neutralization alone was insufficient. The arrest of the asset had halted visible activity, but it had not exposed the external control structure. A decision was made to attempt a controlled continuation of the operation, not to revive it, but to test whether the handler remained active or attentive. The objective was limited: provoke a response without revealing compromise. Using materials recovered during the arrest, analysts reconstructed a plausible continuation package. Numerical strings were altered subtly, retaining structural consistency while embedding signals recognizable only to an active handler. The material was designed to suggest delayed compliance rather than disruption. It was placed beneath the eastern bench during a scheduled picnic on October 13, 1984, following the same timing protocols previously observed. The picnic proceeded as it always had. Food placement occurred at 12:24 p.m. Attendance was average. Cleanup was scheduled for late afternoon. Surveillance teams observed from established positions. No unusual individuals entered the eastern path during the first hour. The package remained untouched. At 2:07 p.m., a man entered the park from the northern lot, walked along the perimeter path and slowed near the benches. He did not stop. He did not look down. He exited without deviation. The package remained. By 4:52 p.m., the picnic concluded. Cleanup ended. The package was still beneath the bench. It was retrieved by federal agents after dark. A second attempt was made 3 weeks later. The timing window was adjusted slightly. The picnic remained unchanged. Again, no retrieval occurred. No placement preceded it. The park showed no signs of resumed activity. Analysis suggested that the handler had either detected compromise or abandoned the asset preemptively. Intelligence doctrine during the Cold War favored rapid disengagement when operational risk increased. Silence was a defensive tactic. The decision was made to terminate the sting. Continued attempts risked revealing federal methodology without meaningful gain. The handler, if still active, had chosen disappearance over recovery. Legal proceedings against the asset advanced quietly. The charges reflected violations related to unauthorized transmission of information and conspiracy with a foreign intelligence service. Proceedings were closed to the public. The sentencing occurred without press coverage. The asset received a custodial sentence consistent with comparable cases of limited scope. No public acknowledgement was made linking the conviction to foreign espionage. Official records referenced procedural violations and classified matters without elaboration. The park was never mentioned. The picnic was never referenced. By early 1985, the investigation file was marked inactive. Portions remained classified. Analysts documented unresolved questions: the handler's identity, the full volume of material transmitted, and whether parallel assets existed. None of these questions received definitive answers. The park returned fully to routine use. Maintenance crews replaced worn benches. Seasonal landscaping altered sight lines slightly. Families continued to gather. The eastern benches were sometimes occupied, sometimes empty. No objects appeared beneath them. The observer continued attending picnics. Their role returned to logistics and cleanup. Federal contact ceased. No follow-up interviews were conducted. The observer was advised only that the matter was concluded. From an institutional perspective, the operation was considered a partial success. An active asset had been identified and neutralized. An operational site had been exposed. However, the broader network had dissolved without revealing its boundaries. The Cold War favored outcomes like this. Intelligence contests were rarely resolved through comprehensive victory. More often they ended in silence, withdrawal, and incomplete knowledge. The absence of activity did not confirm safety. It merely indicated adjustment. In retrospective analysis, the picnic was described not as bait or cover, but as infrastructure. It provided predictability without participation, camouflage without deception. It demonstrated how intelligence operations exploited stability rather than chaos. The handler's fate remained unknown. They may have reassigned resources. They may have exited the field entirely. They may have continued operating elsewhere using similar methods. No confirmation was ever obtained. The case file concluded with a neutral assessment. No lessons were dramatized. No warnings were issued. The documentation emphasized restraint, patience, and the limitations of visibility in civilian spaces. What remained was the understanding that ordinary routines could intersect with geopolitical conflict without those involved ever consenting to participation. The picnic had never changed its purpose. It had only been observed differently. In the years that followed, no further activity was linked to the site. The Cold War itself moved toward resolution, leaving behind records filled with gaps and unanswered questions. This operation became one more entry among many, documented, contained, and ultimately unresolved. The picnic continued. The benches remained. And whatever had passed through that space left no trace visible to those who came afterward.